Welcome. Thank you very much for coming along here today. I really appreciate it. And we've got the event today being recorded as well for people to follow up online and reuse the material. So thank you very much for those who'll be watching later. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Partington. I'm Director of Engineering Policy and Impact here at the institution. But for the report here today, I'm delighted to be able to say a few words to introduce the report. What some of you might not know is that the institution has got 76 years of experience advising the government on the technology and the developments of the auto sector and the implications for the UK. And you might think, why only 76 years? We're a 176-year-old institution. Well, that's because in 1947, the Institution of Automobile Engineers was incorporated into the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. And our archive, I can see Lucy in the room, we have some fantastic material for those of you who haven't had a look at it, and please do have a look. But never, I think, has it been more important that the government listens to the institution, the expert advice from the institution that we have, and the information that we have in our report today. I think we all know that the auto sector has had a lot of press in the last few weeks. The Prime Minister's pushing back of petrol and diesel sales has brought it under sharper focus. And I think it's fair enough to say that the sector is facing quite significant headwinds. However, this report, I would want it to flag as not a reaction to that latest press announcement. This has been quite a time in the making, this report. And Terry, I know you gave a fantastic presentation earlier this year, and that's kickstarted our thinking about the information that sits within this report. So I wanted to point out three facts. I know, Terry, you're going to talk a lot more about the detail. Regardless of what the Prime Minister announced last week, light vehicles are going to be electrified in the next decade. I think that's not a controversial thing to say. I don't think there is a level playing field. If you look at the other countries, what the EU is doing in the US. So if the UK manufacturing is to be competitive, it does need government support. And we need more support for consumers to make the transition to electric vehicles. So Terry, you're probably thinking how much of your reporting I'm going to give away. So I won't say too much. But I did want to say that I'm really pleased that we're not just another voice calling out the problems with the sector. I think this report is quite a comprehensive plan on how we can go about decarbonising light road transport in the UK. I noted, I was thinking about 76 years of experience. Terry, I'll introduce the panel in a sec, but I think maybe you have 76 years of experience between you. So I'm going to move on to introduce Terry, 135th president of the institution, who spent a career working in the sector, most recently commercial director at Myra Technology Park. We've got Paul Jones, who'll be joining in a minute, Andrew Fraser. I'm very pleased that Laura, our policy advisor, is also going to chair the discussion. So thank you very much, Terry. I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you. You've heard that the report's got a few co-authors. You're going to hear from all of us today in the Q&A, hopefully later on as well. But I'm going to be taking you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the report and just really making sure that you get the key messages that we've got in the report. You've been watching the news all week, last week. This is like dealing with fresh food. It goes off very quickly. But I'd like to say that as of 9 o'clock this morning, this report is bang up to date and in sync with the latest news. Come tomorrow, that might not be the case, but that's where we are right now. And, a lot of effort's gone in. I'd like to thank the whole team we've worked with in creating this, because I think it is a really useful communication. And it's been done because really the UK automotive sector is facing a tough time. We've been through the pandemic, as has everybody. We've been through Brexit, as has everybody. We've been at the mercy of semiconductor producers around the world. Other sectors have, but we've been hit pretty hard by that. And we've got really high energy prices as well. And I think when you look at what we're faced with now with electrification, it's the biggest transition the sector's faced in its 138-year history. So it is quite a time. And if we don't do it well, it is going to be a problem. But we do need to do it. 34% of UK carbon dioxide emissions come from road transport. We've got a vehicle fleet on UK roads of about 40 million vehicles. So that's a lot of transitioning. It's okay looking at the new vehicles that are sold into the market, about 1.6 million each year, but we've got a vehicle fleet out there, and that somehow needs to make that transition as well. If in 20 years' time we've still got 30 million old vehicles, then we've probably failed. We've not made that transition successfully. So there are lots of things to consider. But it's a big, big sector. So it employs close to 800,000 people across the UK. It generates annual revenues of £80 billion. So it's a major contributor to the UK economy. And it is really, really important that this transition goes well. Our remit as the Institution of Mechanical Engineers is very clear. So we have 110,000 members, professional engineers and technicians globally, over 140 countries. About 10% of our membership are engaged directly with our automotive sector. So it is a big chunk of what we do. And we're very interested in engineers and making sure that they have, they can really do what we say, which is improving the world for engineering through their careers. The institution is fully committed to net zero. So no matter what I say during this presentation, don't be under any misapprehension. We are fully committed to net zero, but we're also committed to making sure that we have an automotive sector that can continue to contribute to the economy in the years ahead. So how bad is it? Well, it's certainly a sector facing headwinds. There are all sorts of facts and figures I could put down here, but if you look at this table, which looks at the manufacturing statistics, you can look at, I'll just pick out a couple of key ones. Car production's gone down 50% in 5 years. 2022 was the low, which was 750,000 cars. It was the lowest in 30 years. And the factors I explained before have played a part in that. We've seen a 9% reduction in employment. So it is really, really tough. And when you look at what it's doing for the economy, revenues are 18% down. Roughly, the sector, roughly 80% of what we produce in the automotive sector is exported, and that's gone down by 27%. But still, it still represents 10% of all UK's exports. So it is really, really important to the UK economy. What's driving this transition? Well, I think we kind of know that anyway. It's all about, regulation, the need to transition to net zero. When you look at what's happening, battery electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles in the UK, their sales are growing and now represent 20%, which is great. It's absolutely fantastic. Until you start digging a little bit deeper and you realize that 80% of those sales are going to company car buyers and fleet sales. The actual private buyer sales are really, really sluggish. And I think that is a trend that needs to change. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. But when you look at the fact that the ban on petrol and diesel car sales, which was 2030 and was moved back just over a week ago to 2035, and that's been welcomed by some across the industry because they've been planning for it. Well, not planning for the change, but they've been planning for 2030. So when it's put back, it does affect their ability to do what they were planning, and it could affect the investments that they've made. But for others who are less prepared, then certainly a pushback is certainly welcome. The zero emission mandate, which sits alongside that, that still requires vehicle manufacturers to transition and start to produce more and more zero emission vehicles. And we will explore that in more detail, but it is an interesting scenario in that it's not been finally announced what it might be, but later this week, and it's Thursday today, it may be announced. But it is a stick. It's a punitive system to force manufacturers to produce more and more zero emission vehicles. We've also got the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU, that was negotiated in 2020 and came into force in 2021. That is very specific about electric vehicles and in particular about their batteries and what is required so those vehicles can continue to be sold tariff-free. And in 3 months' time, there's a step change in that where it goes from a situation where 30% of the battery needed to be produced locally to a situation where 60% of the battery needs to be produced locally to avoid a 10% tariff. Again, I'll explore that in a little bit more detail as we go along, but these are the things really that are really driving this change along. So let's look at the consumer side of it first of all. And it's quite interesting, and it's fairly true to say that there's probably low private buyer enthusiasm at the moment for this. The company car situation is different. It's booming, and it's booming because it's a complete no-brainer. You pay almost zero tax on a company car that's zero emissions at the moment. It will change, but that is why so many people are making that choice, because financially it makes really good sense to do that. And that's great, but the same does not apply to private sales. When you talk about general public and what their understanding is of electric vehicles and that transition, I think there's still range anxiety where people worry about, is it going to get them to their destination? That's still out there, but I would say, personally, I think that's less of an issue. I think the ranges are going up on these cars because the battery technology is better. So you could have easily a car that will do 250 to 300 miles on one charge. So it is much more of a practical proposition. But there are other issues. One is the purchase cost. The plug-in car grant, which applied to battery electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, was withdrawn last year. So where you get an incentive from the government to go out and buy one, that's gone. And at the moment, not to return. And prices of raw materials that go in particular into the battery, are rising. China has a complete stranglehold on the production the extraction and then the processing of these materials, and to some extent can control the market in the same way that the Gulf states could control the oil and gas market. So we've gone from one region in the world having control to another region in the world having control. And I don't say that in a detrimental way, because China have planned very carefully over the last 15 years that I'm aware of. I used to go to China an awful lot, and I actually saw it firsthand. And they've executed a master planning strategy to get them to the position they're in today. So it's not an accident. It's happened by very careful planning, very careful implementation. But what it means is that at the moment, the cars' prices are going up, and you've got to pay an awful lot of money to buy one of these cars. So I'm sure that's putting a lot of people off. And also public charging. So, if you've got a petrol or diesel car, you would never even think twice about being able to fill it up. You just drive along and find the next one and fill it up. With an electric car, that's not quite the same. You have to plan much more carefully. You have to hope and pray that there's a charger available when you get there and there's nobody using it and it's working. So all these things do make it a little bit difficult. And also there's not that many of them. So, the price of using these chargers, particularly if you're using the high rate ones where you can plug it in and then 20 minutes later you've got another 100 miles of range, it's gone up 46% in the last year. And, you're paying 65p per kilowatt hour, something like that. If you work it out against the current price of petrol, the cost per mile is slightly higher for the electric vehicle than what it is for the petrol vehicle. So the operational cost, the buying cost is higher, the operational cost is higher. And, we've currently got 48,000 public chargers. The graph on the left there, which is in the report, you can see that, to get to where the government wants us to be by 2030, which is a minimum of 300,000 public chargers across the UK, we need to see 35% year-on-year growth. So that graph is not going to be a nice linear trajectory. It's going to be exponential. Will we get there? Well, there we go. That remains to be seen. But for sure, the fact that the government has moved back the 2030 ban on petrol and diesel cars to 2035, it doesn't help the investment case for people investing in charging infrastructure. So there is an issue there, and I'm going to talk about that later on as well. Also, when you look at the taxation side of it, if you're fortunate enough to be able to charge your car at home, you'll pay 5% VAT on the energy that goes into your car. But 45% of UK homes don't have that ability, right? So they've got to rely on public charging, and you'll pay 20% VAT on the charge. So there are some issues there. And you could perhaps argue social inclusion issues, because those who can afford their own nice big house with a nice big driveway, you can afford to do that at home, but the people who can't but still want to make the transition, you're going to have to pay an awful lot more to run that electric vehicle. So there are some challenges there as well. And when it comes down to the good old road tax, at the moment, you don't pay road tax or vehicle excise duty, to give its official name. You don't pay road tax on one of those vehicles, an electric vehicle. But on the 1st of April 2025, you'll pay the same rate that you pay now for a petrol or diesel car. You'll pay £180 per year. And if you buy an electric car that costs over £40,000, bearing in mind that an awful lot of electric cars do cost more than £40,000, you'll have to pay the higher rate, and that's £370 a year. So you're back to where you were with almost a diesel Range Rover today. So it's, vehicle excise duty is worth £30 billion a year to the Treasury. So it is important, and the government needs to get the money in. But if they want to see the transition to zero emissions, is that the right way to do it? Or do we need other things there to make it? So let's look at the zero emission mandate. It's been in the news a lot recently, so I'm going to assume that you know a little bit about it. But basically what it means is that from the 1st of January next year, vehicle manufacturers need to make sure that 22% of the vehicles that they sell in the UK are zero emission. And that is going to step up year on year. If you follow the brown line there, that's the line we're following now, by 2030, that would be about 80% of the sales need to be zero emission. And if you can't do that, if they can't achieve that, and they're selling more petrol and diesel cars than the proportion that's needed to track that line, then there are penalties. And those penalties could be up to £15,000 per car sold. So they're quite substantial penalties for the vehicle manufacturer. So it's a tough one, that. And, the government's moved the line from 2030 to 2035, which is great because it kind of aligns with America, it aligns with Europe and much of the rest of the world. But if the zero emission mandate stays as it is now, it makes no difference because we're forcing the manufacturers to make that transition in the cars that they sell. And I think the challenge is, will there be a market there for those cars? Because the company car market is going to be saturated at some point, and we've got to get people to buy them, as private sales. And I think there is a challenge there. The EU does have they do have a system to encourage the transition, but it's very different to the zero emission mandate. They basically have a fixed point at 2030. They call it Fit for 55, where the fleet average that you sell as a manufacturer needs to be 55% of what the emissions average fleet was for you in 2021. So it's kind of 1 point on the curve that you need to get to. And you could achieve that in different ways by a mix of battery electric vehicles and petrol and diesel. It's perhaps a little more pragmatic. It's certainly less punitive. So, we have sticks out there, but I think really we probably need a lot more carrots, to make this market work. So we have a receptive market. Private consumers, have, to make the choice from selling, trading in your petrol and diesel car and moving to an electric car, you need to really be able to do that without a significant economic penalty. It always needs to be a level transition. So you do it because you want to be green and you've got the ability to do that. And it needs to be a practical proposition. So if you can't find chargers easily, then it's not practical. So it's very, very difficult to make that transition. The TCA, Trade Cooperation Agreement, it was a very difficult document to negotiate, and it was kind of, I suppose its true impact was masked a little bit by the pandemic because they happened in parallel. And I think everybody's focus was on the pandemic and perhaps a little less on the actual Brexit terms. But nevertheless, people were working very hard behind the scenes to put this agreement together. And this applies to, certainly in terms of electric vehicle, it applies to the amount of local content that goes in those. And local content can be something that comes from UK or Europe. The issue is if you go and buy batteries in China to put into a vehicle that you want to sell in the EU or UK, then you're probably going to fall foul of this and have to pay a tariff of 10%. And it applies to all drive batteries. So that's not just battery electric vehicles, it's hybrid vehicles as well. Anything that's got a battery that drives the vehicle forward. Non-compliance, 10% tariff, and just to be fair and honest and transparent and open, if you have a vehicle that you're coming into the UK that doesn't originate, then you're going to pay a 10% tariff anyway. So vehicles coming in from China will pay that. But I think the Chinese government has a slightly different view of how they soften that to make sure that their exports of fully completed electric vehicles continue to grow, and they might support their industry to allow that to do that. And I think that's really what's behind the thing that's kicked off with Ursula von der Leyen in the EU about Chinese imports to make sure it is a level playing field. And that's going to be very interesting to watch how that plays out. But yeah, we've got a big step coming up, 1st of January, and it goes to 60%. And I think it's fair to say that neither the UK nor Europe are ready for that. So what does that mean? It means that if it doesn't change, we're going to be paying tariffs. And that means that tariff is going to be paid probably by the consumer who buys the vehicle. So it's not a good situation. Many across Europe say, yes, we should renegotiate it. But unfortunately, some fairly loud voices say it's been negotiated already and we shouldn't touch it. Right? My personal view is, it will happen. I think they'll change it because I think they have to change it. it'll probably be on the 31st of December this year. But let's see. Let's see. We've got 3 months left to do this. So what's happening in the UK then? I mean, bringing this right back to home. Well, I think vehicle manufacturers, they're pretty smart people. They've seen this change coming. They've been making the plans. They've been investing in certain things. So they're getting ready for this transition. And that was based on 2030. In actual fact, so they're going to be ready ahead of the game. Ford plan to make 100% plug-in hybrid. So every vehicle you get from Ford will have a plug on it in some description by 2026. JLR are investing 15 billion, and a lot of that's going to go into electrification. BMW, I could put a long list of these, but I've just picked out 3. BMW, we all know the electric Mini is going to go to China, but in 2030 it's going to come back to the UK and be produced in Calgary again. But 50% of their vehicles across BMW will be electric by 2025. So that's the industry. Let's look at government. Well, a lot's been done already. It's easy to be critical. It is really easy to be critical. It's not helpful, I don't think, to be critical, because we're not going to solve this problem by being critical of each other. We need to work together to really make it happen. And a lot's been done already. We've got the Faraday Battery Challenge, 318 million. We've got the Advanced Propulsion Centre. It's probably way over 1.4 billion now. There's lots of things here. There's probably about £6 billion worth of stuff on there that's been invested by the government to try and help the transition. But, is that enough? Is a question to ask. And I would speculate, and I'm going to explain why in a minute, that it's probably not enough by an order of magnitude. Okay, so lots needs to be done. And also, when you make these investments, you can't just do it ad hoc. I think it needs to be driven really by a strategy. And that strategy isn't there. It's not in place for the UK as to how we make this transition, how the government helps industry, how we get foreign direct investment coming in to make it all happen. That's not happening, and that needs to happen. China, as I mentioned already, have taken a very different stance. And, I used to run an operation in China, and, at that time they joked with me because we were telling them how to design cars. We were teaching them how to design cars. They said, Mr. Spall, we will overtake you. We will leapfrog you. I said, okay, fine. And it sounded incredulous at that time. But in reality, that's exactly what they've done. And hats off, it's a master planning strategy. So I think China's done a really good job. They have something called the New Energy Vehicle, and that program helps people to buy an electric vehicle. It helps them to make the transition, and they've helped industry to gear up to get the global supply chains they need, all the critical minerals, and then all of the gigafactories, and I'll tell you how many they've got very shortly, but very, very impressive. When you look at America, well, they've got the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm sure you've all heard about that. That's $783 billion worth of investment to make the transition to net zero. If we did the same here, if we had the Inflation Reduction Act here, or an equivalent to it, I'm going to thank the Green Alliance now because they announced this last week and I've just stolen it from them. But they reckoned it would take £64 billion to create something that would of the same magnitude that could have the same impact. So the government spent about $6 billion. We probably need about $64 billion to make a transition that will be proportionate to the UK. So, are we too late? Is it all too late? Has the horse bolted? Well, we certainly missed the opportunity, I think, to be ahead of the game. So we're on the back foot, but I think there is still a chance to emerge with an automotive sector of scale, providing action is taken, and that's kind of what this report is all about. We're going to spell out really what we think are the actions that need to be taken, but time is very short. And, if we don't get it right, what's it going to mean? It's going to mean that there's going to be a huge surge in imported electric vehicles, which some people think, well, it doesn't matter. I buy foreign goods all the time. It's absolutely fine. But in reality, when it comes down to achieving net zero, if you produce a car in the UK, because of our renewables, our high percentage of renewables, it produces 12% less carbon dioxide emissions than producing a car in some of the other countries. Certainly, if you take the EU and an average across the EU, we're 12% less than that average. So it's a great place to manufacture cars from a net zero perspective. So there are all sorts of things playing out here, but it's not going to be an easy situation to resolve, but it can be resolved. I'm going to look at the supply chain now. The picture on the right there, if you're wondering what it is, it's not a bank of swimming pools. It's a picture of the Atacama Desert in Chile, where they have lithium evaporation ponds. Okay, where they basically extract brine that's rich in lithium salts, and they evaporate it under the sun, and that produces the lithium compounds that we need. to make lithium-grade battery material with a few extra things. So these guys produce a lot of the world's lithium. Combined with Australia, who produce it in a different form, it's in a rock form called spodumene. Those two together, the lion's share of the world's lithium comes from those places. So that goes into our gigafactories, right? And I say our gigafactories. We probably have one that would classify as a gigafactory, and it produces 1.9 gigawatt hours of battery capacity per year. And that's up in Sunderland, the AESC facility run by Envision that supports Nissan. There is another one under construction right next to it, which will add 30 gigawatt hours of capacity. And you probably heard the announcement from Tata. They're going to build one in Somerset, and that's rumoured to be 40 gigawatt hours, which is great, which is really, really great. The Faraday and APC Advanced Propulsion Centre suggests that we might need about 5 gigafactories in this country, producing probably north of 90 to 100 gigawatt hours of battery capacity per year. So we are nowhere near where we need to be. And these things take a long time to build. So we're probably behind the curve in terms of being ready to produce our own batteries, which affects our readiness for the trade and cooperation agreement to be able to say we've got local content on batteries. So you can see how these things stack up. How do we compare with Europe? Well, with Germany, they've got 4 operational gigafactories. They've got 5 under construction and 5 in planning, with a total capacity of 380 gigawatt hours. So they're doing pretty well. There's plants all over Europe. America has plans to create 1,000 gigawatt hours, and the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be supporting that, and that's by 2030. So that's pretty impressive. China is off the scale. We'd need logarithmic graph paper to add China to the same chart. They've got 125 gigafactories already, and they are going to get to a capacity of 3,377 gigawatt hours by 2031. And that is 50% of the total gigafactory output of the whole world at that point in time that's forecast. So they've got it absolutely stitched up. But things aren't all bad in the UK. We have lithium in the Cornish mines. There are companies now exploring how to get that lithium out to a level that it can be used economically in our own processes. It's estimated maybe 50% of our need for lithium could come from those mines. And there's a facility being built on Tees Valley that will process what comes out, which is lithium hydroxide, lithium sulfate, and then it can be converted into what we need for batteries. And they reckon it could probably support about 1 million vehicle batteries per year from that factory. So we could actually be an exporter of those processed materials. And they're quite interesting because the Tees Valley processing plant have already set up deals in Australia where they can buy the spodumene that's extracted from the earth, and it's processed to lithium sulfate in Australia and then shipped to the UK, where it's then processed into lithium hydroxide. So there's a supply chain starting to build up there. So that's really good news. And I think also, this last point here, and I'm going to come back to a point on here actually, which I just missed, but this last point here about recycling is crucial because we can't continue to rip materials out of the earth. At some point, it's got to be reused, recycled. And the good thing is that a lot of these things that are used in batteries are fully recyclable if you've got the right technology to recycle them back to a stage where it can be put through the process again and used to create new batteries. There's lots of startups in the UK and elsewhere that are investigating this. I think it's an opportunity for the UK. We could be a leader in this area. We have the brains, we have the skills. What we're not very good at is then taking those really great ideas and patenting it and commercially exploiting it. I think other people do that better than we do. So that's something we perhaps need to focus on. I was going to mention this because there are, lithium comes from here, from the Atacama Desert. It comes from Australia in mines, and it's ripped out of the ground. It also lies on the seabed. There are things called polymetallic nodules that lie on the seabed, which you don't need to mine. You can literally pick it up off the seabed. It's about the size of a potato, but it contains copper, nickel, manganese, and cobalt, which are 4 of the key ingredients you need to make batteries. So why are we not doing it already? Well, it's got all sorts of environmental challenges because these things are not just at paddling depth. They're at 4,500 meters in the middle of the Pacific. But it's calculated that there's more than enough materials lying on the seabed to fully support the transition of the whole world's vehicle fleet to electric batteries. So it might be something that could be investigated. The UK happens to be pretty good, actually, at marine engineering. So there is an opportunity to perhaps, get in there and try and see if we can find a way to extract these minerals without causing environmental and ecological damage that's irreversible. Okay, so it needs to be done very responsibly, but there's an opportunity there if we decided to take it. China is on this already. So they might be the first country in the world to extract these. And I say extract, harvest is probably a better word, because you grab them off the ocean floor. What else do we need to make this transition? Well, certainly we need skills. And that means significant retraining. And if you think about, the current network of garages and dealers that support your cars, your petrol and diesel cars at the moment, they've got technicians. They're used to working on mechanical products. They need to be transitioned to working on high voltage and electronics and so on. So it's a big transition to make. The people who put the charge points in, they also need to be converted as well. So think how many people working, that's hundreds of thousands of people working in these areas. They need to be transitioned to work in a new, sustainable automotive industry. Energy costs are really interesting. I mean, it's fair to say that it affects everybody, but in 2022, we had the third highest electricity cost for businesses across the EU. And that is a significant impediment. So we need to do better at trying to manage those costs, or at least do what other countries do and subsidise it for industry. So it's not trying to deal with an unlevel playing field. And all good fun. We've got a general election coming up fairly soon. We're not quite sure when, but it will happen very soon. And to be honest, in terms of this transition, it couldn't come at a worse time, because it will slow down legislative output for sure. It'll be affected by perhaps a little bit of short-termism thinking, political agendas to help to get their party through the election successfully. And it creates regulatory uncertainty. So these are headwinds that we've got to deal with. We can't do anything about it. We've got to deal with it, but it will, if we're not careful, affect this transition. So let's look at the recommendations for the report in sort of a summation of this. And I'm going to just go through a few headings. This is a level playing field for the UK. A short-term fix for the trade and cooperation agreement is essential. I think it will happen, but we can't just assume it will. It needs to happen so we've got frictionless trade that's not an impediment to both EU and UK companies working in this area. We need increased support and importantly, strategic investments in the auto sector, as has happened in other countries, to help us to make that transition to net zero, and do so in a way that kind of protects the industry we have and the jobs we have, because we have all the right skills there to do this really well in the future. So it'd be an absolute tragedy if we lost that in the process of transition. I've already said that the transition is going to be quite costly. So when I talk about investments, we're not talking about a few £billion. We're talking about maybe 50 or 60 billion pounds. It's substantial. But, I think if you looked at it as a straight commercial proposition, given how much the UK generates, how much the automotive sector generates for the UK economy, it's a really good, sound commercial proposition, a really good return on investment. To support the transition, certainly a holistic approach to incentivise battery electric vehicle private purchases, taking account of whether households have the option of domestic charging or not, right? If we haven't got a market for these vehicles that the vehicle manufacturers are being forced by regulation to produce, what's going to happen? Right? Who's going to buy these things? You're going to end up in a situation where they have to price cut these things to get the market to move. Things need to happen. This is the biggest weakness in the current situation of government intervention I can see. If they don't do something to stimulate the market, it is going to be a car crash. So we need to make sure that happens. We need to boost charge point deployment, mandating targets so that they do actually get built. Now, given that we're in a situation where the 2030 pushback to 2035 has created uncertainties, if you're a charge point provider and you're going to invest millions, if not hundreds of millions, in providing charge point infrastructure, don't have that guarantee that all vehicles produced will be electric by 2030. Yeah, we have the mandate there, and that's going to help get us up to 80% at least. But it's really, the risk is probably higher now because of that. And that risk might need to be underwritten by government to make sure that those investments happen and the charge points get delivered. And certainly we need a nationwide skills and retraining plan for the automotive sector. We need to upskill, we need to transition people. We don't want to lose them. There's jobs there for them in the future, just different jobs, working on different kinds of products. When it comes to domestic battery production, the government needs to create the right, and government and industry, if you like, needs to create the right conditions for this volume production of batteries to happen in the UK. It needs to provide the enabling funding, because it won't happen without it. If you look at what's happening in America and in certain places in Europe and certainly in China, the government has got a strategic plan and is even making these investments to make sure that this infrastructure is delivered. And that needs to happen here at scale. And also we need to create our supply chains. So we've got stability, we've got security, and we've got the ability to do it in an economically viable way. So we don't produce vehicles that are not competitive. Given that there's more to electric vehicles than just the battery, there's power electronics and drive motors and so on. It'd be great to create clusters, around the hubs, because certainly with the case of batteries, they don't transport too well. So you need to make them where you want to use them. And I can see a great opportunity for bringing together, all those skills that are going to support those vehicle manufacturers into clusters. And I think when you think about who's going to make these investments, who's going to invest in gigafactories, who's going to invest in the supply chain, it's probably true to say it's not all going to be UK. In fact, only a small percentage of it will be UK. So it's going to be foreign direct investment. And when you look at what's happening in the world now, when you look at when Elon Musk steps off a plane, people are all over him because they want to get his investments in their countries. So we need to be really, really sharp as a nation to make sure that we are in that race, and ideally at the front of the queue, to make sure that we win these FDI opportunities to build infrastructure, to build capability in the country. And that's going to be very, very important. In terms of innovation and value capture, well, we need to get better at expediting scale up and commercialization of new battery technologies. When you look across the network of startups in the UK, there's some fantastic things going on. So new technologies, battery technologies being developed that are really going to make a difference if they are successful. We seem to be great in this country at innovation and creating these great ideas, and absolutely rubbish at exploiting them. We need to get better at exploiting them to the benefit of the UK. Being completely open and honest, the UK should benefit through those ideas that are created, and the way to do that is to make sure that they get through the valley of death into scale up and successfully commercialized. I could talk all day about the technologies, but that's not for this presentation. But it's there, and it's ours to do something with, really. So more support needed in there. And when it comes to critical minerals, well, we're at the back of the queue. We're late to the party. Most of the stuff's already gone. We need to get in that queue, sort it out, and work out how we're going to get those minerals, how we're going to source them, how we're going to mine them, how we're going to process them. There are things happening, as I've already spoken about, but really, we need to fully resolve it, and that probably needs a strategy, a national strategy to do that. The government's already got a critical mineral strategy that covers all sectors, but I think the automotive is a fairly special case because it needs quantums of investment that probably go beyond other sectors, and really that needs to be looked at. And also, we do have our own resources. We actually export graphite to China so they can build anodes for the batteries. So that comes from the UK. We could actually use it here, perhaps, I don't know. But anyway, we need to work out what we've got and how best to use it. There's stuff going on in government and industry as well. Don't get me wrong, it is happening, but it is really important that we get this sorted. So it's very clear. If you invest in a gigafactory in the UK, you're going to put £3 or £4 billion on the line to do that, that you've got some surety that you're going to get the critical minerals coming in to actually make it work. And when it comes down to recycling, I think we've got a really good position. I think within government, at the moment, it sits in DEFRA, and I think that needs to be broadened out across other departments of government. But we need a cohesive plan to make sure that this is an opportunity that could be leveraged for the UK, because I think we could do some really good stuff there. So, in conclusion, I think the UK is in a position where our auto sector is in a perilous position unless significant effort goes in now to resolve some of the issues. It is really now or perhaps never, because if we lose it, we will lose it. And yes, we'll still make small numbers of expensive cars with good marks on them, but the volume manufacture that really drives the industry, creates the quantums, creates the economic benefit for the country, that will disappear away and will become an importer of vehicles. The mandate alone is not enough. It's very clear. So I hope the government's not going to issue that today, tomorrow, and then put its pen down. It's not enough. You need to have an effective transition plan, and that means creating a receptive market so that the average motorist, he might drive a Mondeo or whatever he drives, the average motorist can make the choice to say, I want to have an electric vehicle, and he can do so without financial impediment. So it's a level transition, and it's a practical proposition. So there's a whole network of chargers all across the UK that can charge that car. If that doesn't happen, then the zero emission mandate is going to run into trouble because we haven't got a receptive market to take those vehicles. So a little bit of gloom and doom, but it's not too late. It genuinely is not too late. And I think the prize of the transition, which is really a net zero transmission, a really effective net zero transition, but coming out of this with an intact UK automotive industry that is off scale and contributing in the same way it has in the past to the UK economy. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I think, Matt, you're going to come and take my place. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'm Matt Rooney, Head of Policy at the institution, and we have time for a brief panel discussion. So I'd like to invite Terry to join Paul Jones and Andrew Fraser, co-authors of the report, and Laura Kent, who's going to chair the discussion.
Shall I go first?
Yes, please. Thank you.
I think Terry's done a super job of sort of outlining the sort of the content of the paper, and I think really the crux of it is now sort of collaboration between industry and government going forward. I mean, there's been significant investment by industry over the last few years. We've seen north of 11 billion in the last 2 to 3 years invested. You've heard the announcements around Tata, around sort of JLR, Bentley, Vauxhall, up at Ellesmere Port. So there's been significant investment, but now government needs to come together with industry. There's the ZEV mandate on its own. You can't just have a stick. As Terry said, sticks don't move markets, carrots do. So we need this collaboration now to work together.
Yeah, thanks. Andrew Fraser, spent my automotive career with Ford. To me, Terry alluded to it, the mathematics of investment are a very brilliant case. I'll be controversial for a minute. The business case for HS2 has hovered between 120% payback, getting back 20% more value, and the most recent figure says at best 80%. But it's around break even, but we've progressed with that. As Terry said, 1.7 million vehicles a year, an average value of 30 to 40,000. It's a 50 to 60 billion a year industry. Investing 10% of that, this is a number Terry was talking about, it's a 1,000-fold payback. Why wouldn't you invest in preventing that level of loss of industrial capacity and imports? So to me, there's a really, really clear choice on the commercial side and the technical side. Automotive industry supports a huge number of technical elements, whether it's lightweight materials, recyclability, battery investment, semiconductors, power electronics. It's a vast range of technologies which support the industry and then go forward due to the scale and the volume of the cost effectiveness and the reliability which they generate into other sectors as well. As an example, we all like to think that an ambulance is going to take us to hospital if we need it. Ambulances exist because the car industry exists, and they're cost effective. They're based off vans, and we need that sort of synergy, which we often don't think about across the industry. That our entire ecosystem is supported by this, and it really, really needs to survive and prosper. So yeah, I'm very passionate about this at a technical level. I want to see future generations of engineer enjoying the sort of career which perhaps the three of us have had over the last 30 or 40 years, enjoying that. And I want to see exploitation of technology. We invented lithium-ion batteries in this country. You wouldn't actually believe it, but given where we stand now, as well as liquid crystal displays, and where did our LCD electronics industry end up? Mostly in the Far East. So we should recognise some of those great innovations coming out of our universities and industry, and as Sarah said, exploit and commercialise them for our national good, because that's what enables us to maintain our standard of living.
Great, thank you. I'm going to use my position to kickstart the questions, if that's okay. So my first one, is the zero emission vehicle mandate the right policy to instigate the net zero transition? I don't know who wants to take that, Terry.
Quite should lost with the question.
Is the zero emission vehicle mandate the right policy to instigate the net zero transition?
Okay. Well, it is certainly one way to do it. No question about it. We need the industry to transition, and we need to give it a nudge to make sure it does transition. But as I mentioned in the presentation, that I think just pushing the manufacturers to a position where they have to comply or else, in quite a punitive way, alone is not enough. It won't work, very clearly. We need the market to come with it. And ideally, we want market pull. We want people to want to buy electric vehicles, so the manufacturers have to respond to produce more of them. That's a far better position to be in than something that's mandated. What's good about the mandate is the fact that it's fairly clear and fairly certain. So vehicle manufacturers can plan to produce cars in line with that requirement. I think that's the positive. But as I say, and I'll say just one final time, it's not enough on its own. We need to stimulate the market.
And I think just to pick up on that, the simple facts, transitioning to an electric vehicle from its petrol or diesel equivalent involves a sort of 40 to 50% price increase in terms of the new purchase price. So it's one factor, we need help with. You've then got the charging infrastructure, as Terry talked about. We've largely overcome range anxiety, but we have now what we call charge anxiety, where people are worried, will I find a charging point? If I find a charging point, is it going to work? And then we come back to, as Terry mentioned earlier, the sort of 45% of households that don't have the luxury of off-street parking. Therefore, they have to go to a public charging point if they can find one and it's working, and they pay VAT at 20% as opposed to 5%. And I think maybe just final point then, again, as Terry alluded, when April 2025, when vehicle excise duty comes back in, so you're paying the same excise duty or road tax on an electric vehicle as you are on a non-electric vehicle. And that over £40,000 purchase price, you're paying this additional VED. And, making a green choice should not be taxed as a luxury.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment as well?
Oh, of course.
Yeah. There is a role for mandates. California has perhaps set the scene with its program, but that's been running for 30 years. It commenced in the mid-90s. It currently runs until 2025. So it's been a very, very gradual process. Our current approach is very steep, a very short period between 2024 and 2030. And as Terry alluded, it hasn't yet been actually declared officially, less than 3 months before it's due to start, which is the blink of an eye in automotive industry terms. So I am concerned that it's very short. If you look at Norway, they've had a zero VAT rate on electric vehicles since 2003, I think, it's been a 20-year supported transition to get where Norway is. And they're currently around the 80% zero emission vehicle mark, which is our ambition for 2030. But they've taken a 20-year holistic incentivization approach. And a phrase I saw a while back, the Scottish government originally announced that by 2032, their aim was to remove the need to buy a combustion engine vehicle. And I thought that phrase was quite good because it reflected the technological, the charging infrastructure, the price parity, all of those factors come together and say, yes, I don't need a combustion engine car anymore, an electric alternative. And that to me was the right reflection of a market-led approach. And I think we ought to be thinking more in those terms.
Great, thank you. Is there any questions in the room at all before? Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I had a couple of questions that I'd be interested in exploring.
Of course.
One specific point that I wanted some clarification on was around the sort of concern around the number of vehicles going into company cars and fleets, etc. So I just wanted to sort of explore why that seems to be as big a problem as you sort of suggested in your summary. Because it seems to me that possibly going into fleets actually means they enter the second-hand market quicker, so actually can become therefore more affordable for more people. So that could be a sort of a benefit. So I'd be interested in hearing some views on that. And then my second sort of specific question was, the recommendation says a holistic approach to sort of stimulating demand. What specific mechanism do you think that should take? Is that reintroduced plug-in grant as it was before? Is it a higher grant or some other sort of mechanism? Is it changing tax rates? Or what do you actually envisage that being?
Okay.
So I'll take the second question. I'll let you guys answer the first question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So to answer your second question, we deliberately, we could think of many things the government could do. Right, there's lots of levers it can pull to invigorate the market. If you look at America, they've got tax credits, $7,500 for a car, providing certain percentage of that car has been produced in America. We could look at VAT rate. We could look at the charging situation. We could look at vehicle excise duty. I think we probably thought of about 10 different ways in which the government could do this. Now, it's probably more for the government to take the task of stimulating the market and work out for themselves what's the most efficient way to do it. Because obviously taxation is important, because without taxation, we can't drive the country. So we're not anti-taxation, but I think what we're recognising here is that we need, as other countries have recognised, a way of stimulating the market. If they look around the world, if they look to China, look across Europe, look to America and other nations, there are lots of really good examples of how it's been done. So it's not reinventing the wheel. It's really looking for what's going to work for the UK, given our current position.
Can I make an addition to that? I was at the Cenex Low Carbon Vehicle Conference back in the beginning of the month, and one of the plenary sessions, there was a presentation about the different international approaches being taken around incentivizing zero-emission vehicles. And there was a speaker from the Netherlands, a gentleman called Harm, apologies, I can't remember his surname. And he put out some very clear slides showing the economic case for zero-emission vehicles purchased and operated in the Netherlands currently. And in most cases, the boxes were green. He had different sectors, different sizes of vehicles. But he then showed the same charts with all the current government incentives backed out, and they all went red or orange compared with current vehicles. And he made the very clear point that without ongoing government incentives around the vehicles themselves and around charging infrastructure, in which Netherlands, I think, is currently the European leader, the market doesn't work. And to me, it was a really clear example. And we had him standing at Millbrook in September explaining how the market needs to be incentivized ongoing. The expectation which existed perhaps 5 years ago that battery prices are going to continue on an exponential downward curve by 2025, we'd get to parity or even lower costs for both purchase and operation of electric vehicles, has not come to pass. As Terry said, battery prices have risen significantly and are continuing to rise. I think the head of CATL, the world's biggest manufacturer, said at best they might start to reverse in 2024, but that expected decline in pricing is not yet apparent, and it will require some time to make the transition. And humans are rational beings. If they're faced with a choice, why would you choose the expensive choice? There's a limit to environmental support willingness when we're also paying a lot more for food and all other aspects of life. So I think that's a key factor. So if I can pick up on the second question about the company cars, I think the two elements. One's perhaps psychological. There's sort of, yes, everyone's buying BEVs, 16% market share, 16.5% in August, but only 4% of those, give or take, are private consumers. So there's a split in the market, I think, which is disguising that, as what Terry said. What has also happened is, you're right, cars are arriving in the new car market, but because the benefit in kind tax for company car buyers is so generous, there are an awful lot of very, very expensive, 80 to 100,000 pound BEVs. You can name the brands, Taycans, e-trons. I'm not big on Volkswagen Group, but there's some very nice, which with the benefit in kind tax made a really attractive proposition 2 or 3 years ago when the lease came out. iPaces, they're now coming into the market, but the depreciation on those now is so steep that it feeds back into the lease costs. And that is actually now driving up the lease cost of a new BEV, because the finance industry is saying, oh yes, I had an £80,000 car 3 years ago, it's now a £30,000 residual. They've got to finance that depreciation, and that is driving up the lease costs of the new vehicles again and making them more expensive for the potential new car buyer. So there is a loop there. So yes, cheap second-hand cars are nice if that's the market you're playing in, and people definitely should be investigating that. But it still feeds back to the point of sale. It comes back. So that's the market. And there's some good data around from the likes of Auto Trader, who have fantastic data about the way the industry works, showing the real change in the market in the last year as a lot of these vehicles which were leased in 2020 and beyond are starting to appear in the second-hand car market, and the shift in residual values now between, I've seen comparisons of the iPace versus F-Pace, two Jaguar products, effectively equivalent, both Jaguar SUVs, if you like, different powertrain solution. A year ago, the iPace was selling at a huge premium to an F-Pace in the used market, they've more or less got back to parity now, even though the purchase price was dramatically different. So there is some good news in there, but there's some key issues being hidden by that benefit in kind tax.
So maybe just to add a bit further, we're moving from the early adoption phase to the mass adoption phase now. So we do need support, and it's not all about sort of direct government sort of payment and incentive. Rules of origin, as Terry alluded to earlier, when the rules of origin for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement were written some 3-4 years ago, pre-pandemic, pre sort of war in Ukraine, we all thought that where the battery supply chain would be, and as Andrew said, sort of price parity, we'd be a lot further on that journey than we are. So we definitely need to do something with the rules of origin. Otherwise, we're inflicting a bit of an own goal between ourselves and the EU. So, nobody wants a sort of 10% hike on purchase price of something which is already considerably more expensive than the petrol diesel equivalent. On the charging points, we have no mandated targets on charge point rollout. So, there are lots of different estimates. Let's say we're all in agreement that we need at least 300,000 public charging points by 2030. Some people will say significantly higher, 400,000 or 500,000. But what we are behind on that rollout. We need to be installing something like 3,000 charging points a month, every month between now and 2030. And I think the best we've done this year is about 1,200 a month so far. So we're behind on that journey. So we need some mandated targets for charge point rollout. And then I think we come back to the VAT on charging again. We need to do something there. We've got this disparity where 5%, for off-street charging and sort of 20% for public charging. We need to do something there as well.
Great, thank you. Just was that a hand up? Yeah, please. No. Just when after you've answered your question, when you respond, if you could just wrap up with some closing remarks as well. But yeah, sorry, Margaret, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, one thing that interests me about all this is what's the role of China? Do you think switching to the electric transition is going to have a national security, strong implications for the UK? Terry said China has a stranglehold on production batteries, the control of the minerals. What's the implication for our auto sector? Are we going to be way too reliant on China?
Yes.
Probably best qualified.
I think I find it fascinating to look at what's happened with China. They've done an absolute brilliant job to get to where we are now. We operate in a world where free and fair trade is of paramount importance. So we have to accept the fact that they will be dominant in this area, as they've dominated many other aspects of manufacturing. And that isn't necessarily a negative thing. Okay, and I think we do enjoy, in general, good relations with China. So I think it's more about collaboration and working together. If Chinese vehicle manufacturers want to establish manufacturing in the UK, I'm sure the government would welcome them to do that. When it comes down to future research in battery technology, there are lots of areas where collaboration could help both nations to move forward. We are very small compared to China, but we punch above our weight when it comes to research and many other aspects of development and creating wealth and prosperity. So I think there's a relationship there that could be very collaborative going forward. And I think we shouldn't be overly punitive because we're losing. I think we need to accept the fact that they've done really well, but we can still do well. And I think our report hopefully will help to explain how we can do that.
Great, thank you. Paul, Andrew, just as you're doing some closing remarks, could I also ask you, we've talked a lot about electrification, but is that the only answer? What other answers are there?
So I think, in terms of the small sort of medium-sized passenger car, I think the battery electric race is one there. But I think certainly when we come to sort of heavier vehicles, certainly heavy commercial vehicles with totally different duty cycles, I think there's definitely a role for hydrogen, be that hydrogen fuel cell or maybe hydrogen combustion. We have to remember that, internal combustion engines are not the problem. It's the fossil fuels that are the problem in terms of emissions. So I think we've got an opportunity to sort of sweat that existing infrastructure that we've built up over the last sort of 120 years, maybe as a transition then in the longer term to something else with heavier vehicles.
Great. Andrew?
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I'd echo Paul's comment. I think mainly due to the success of one Musk Esquire and the desire of pretty much every automotive CEO to amass something similar to Elon's fortunes, the battery race is only going in one direction. I applaud Toyota for their pursuit of the hydrogen vehicles with Mirai and such like, and that they're having some success, particularly in mainland Europe. There are Mirai taxi fleets in the likes of Paris and Berlin with some dedicated infrastructure. However, we've already highlighted today the shortfalls in the electric vehicle infrastructure. I think the near medium-term prospect of developing a mass vehicle infrastructure for hydrogen is going to be quite a steep challenge for commercial vehicles, as Paul said, with depots or back-to-base refueling or dedicated sort of HGV type refueling stations. It's much more of a feasible proposition. But the prospect of diverging our existing petrol and diesel infrastructure into both electric and hydrogen for the mass scale in the next 5 to 10 years, I think is a major stretch. So I'm with Paul. I don't see that happening, but I do applaud Toyota for pursuing that technology, because there should be a diversity of, and I think in different parts of the world there are different solutions. The carbon intensity of the electricity grid is a key factor in the choice of end technology. Japan has a very, very different electricity grid from Britain or the rest of Europe. I think Terry mentioned the carbon intensity. We're remarkably good. The decarbonisation of our grid has been a huge success story over the last decade or so. Countries like Poland, Korea, Japan, China, where the electricity is much more intensively carbon produced, are not as far along that journey. So Terry mentioned that there are significant advantages to both building, critically, and operating a plug-in electric vehicle in this country, because the grid is now fairly clean and is improving quite significantly. And that's a key factor. And one of the reasons perhaps why countries like Norway have really progressed, because they've got almost 100% hydropower. They're also one of the world's biggest producers of oil and gas, but they export most of it. So they're in a particularly good position, generate all their own domestic electricity, carbon-free, and export the fuels to stoke up their strategic investment fund. But yes, lots of solutions out there. I think up to the sort of light, medium van size is almost certainly going to be electrified. The heavier vans right through to 44 tons. It's a very open market currently, but it's one that we need to continue to really play in. It's been a huge success, and I think the country is partly identified by what we build and make, and that whether it's E-Type Jaguars or James Bond's Aston Martin. I mean, part of our image as a nation is around the vehicles that we've designed and produced in the past, and we need to maintain that world leading, not just the image, but the capability that goes with it in the years and decades to come.
Fantastic. I don't know if I'm about to put my foot in it, but maybe next James Bond movie, an electric car as the main car, or do you not think we're there yet? And on that point around James Bond, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists and authors, and to Matt for the hard work you put into this report. Please do stick around. We've got plenty of coffee and pastries, and I don't want to eat it all. So thank you all for coming, and thank you.
Thank you.